The first thing I heard wasn't the engine, it was the scream. "Mom, they're here! They're actually here!" The terrified voice echoed across the gravel yard, just as 3 sheriff's cruisers skidded to a stop outside my equipment barn. Red and blue lights splashed across the white siding of my farmhouse, turning the quiet evening into something that looked more like a crime scene than a peaceful rural neighborhood. A teenage boy burst through the barn doors, his boots slipping in the loose gravel. His face had gone ghost white. Behind him, my bright green tractor, worth every bit of $90,000, sat idling crookedly, its front loader buried halfway into a stack of wooden pallets. Fresh scratches ran along the side where someone had clearly clipped the metal doorframe, trying to force it out. "You said nobody would know," the boy shouted toward the woman standing near the driveway. His mother didn't answer. She couldn't. The woman everyone in our subdivision simply called Karen, the iron-fisted president of the Homeowners Association, stood frozen with both hands pressed against her mouth. Her perfectly styled blonde hair had come loose in the humid evening air, and the confidence she'd worn like expensive jewelry for years had vanished in seconds. One deputy stepped toward her. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "is this your son?" She swallowed hard before nodding. I can explain." "No," another deputy replied, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his duty belt. "You can explain downtown." Her eyes darted across the yard until they landed on me. "You did this," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger. "You set him up." I didn't move. I simply stood beside the patrol truck, arms folded across my chest, watching years of intimidation collapse in real time. "No," I answered quietly. "I warned you." The teenage boy suddenly pointed at me, confusion replacing panic. "Wait," he stammered. "You're the owner." Before I could answer, the county sheriff himself stepped out of the last SUV. The entire yard went silent. Even the tractor's diesel engine seemed louder. The sheriff removed his sunglasses slowly, looked directly at the HOA president, then at her son. Finally, he turned toward me. "Deputy Mason Carter," he said with a faint smile. "Looks like your stolen property wasn't hard to find after all." Karen's knees nearly gave out. Her son stared at me as though he'd seen a ghost. "What?" he whispered, backing away. "You're a sheriff's deputy?" I nodded once. "I've been one for 18 years. The color drained completely from Karen's face, because at that exact moment, another deputy walked out of the barn, carrying something none of us expected to find inside. And the instant I saw what was in his hands, I realized this case had just become far bigger than a stolen tractor. My name is Mason Carter. I'm 46 years old, and for the last 18 years, I've served as a deputy with the Redstone County Sheriff's Office in Cedar Ridge, Texas. Around town, most people know me as someone who doesn't raise his voice unless he absolutely has to. I've spent nearly 2 decades talking people through their worst days, settling disputes before they turn violent, and reminding myself that patience usually wins where anger fails. That patience would be tested more than I ever imagined. When I wasn't wearing a badge, I was working my family's land. My grandfather bought the 32 acres just outside Cedar Ridge after returning home from Korea. He built the white farmhouse with his own hands, dug the stock pond, planted rows of pecan trees, and believed that if you cared for the land, it would care for you. My father carried on that tradition until cancer took him far too young. After he passed, I promised my mother I'd never sell a single acre, no matter how much developers offered. Every fence post, every weathered oak, every trail winding through the pasture carried a memory. This wasn't just property, it was my family's history written into the soil. 3 years earlier, a luxury subdivision called Willow Creek Estates had been built on the neighboring ranch. At first I welcomed the new families. Kids waved when they rode their bikes past my entrance. A few neighbors even bought fresh eggs from me on weekends. I figured we could all get along despite living very different lives. Then the Homeowners Association elected Diane Whitmore as its president. Diane had an uncanny talent for inserting herself into problems that didn't exist. She complained about the sound of my tractor during daylight hours, claimed my hay bales were an eyesore, and once mailed me a formal letter insisting my American flag was mounted at the wrong visual angle because it could be seen from the subdivision entrance. I laughed the first few times. After all, my farm wasn't inside the HOA. Their rules ended exactly where my property line began. At least, They were supposed to. One Saturday morning, I climbed into my John Deere tractor to mow the back pasture before the Texas heat became unbearable. The machine wasn't just expensive, it was essential. Between mowing, hauling feed, clearing storm debris, and maintaining the acreage, I used it almost every day. As I worked near the fence separating my land from Willow Creek Estates, I noticed 3 people standing on the other side. Diane, a teenage boy I recognized as her son, Tyler, and a man in a tailored suit holding a clipboard. They weren't talking. They were pointing, straight at my tractor. When Tyler noticed me looking, he quickly lowered his hand. But Diane didn't. Instead, she smiled, a thin, practiced smile that never reached her eyes. She said something to the man beside her, and he scribbled notes before all 3 turned and walked away. I couldn't hear a single word. But something about that silent conversation settled heavily in my stomach. For the first time since Willow Creek Estates had been built, I had the unmistakable feeling that they weren't just complaining about my property anymore. They were planning something. I tried convincing myself I was overthinking what I'd seen at the fence. After all, suspicion comes with the badge. When you've spent years investigating burglaries, fraud, and domestic disputes, it's easy to see danger where there isn't any. I told myself Diane Whitmore was probably complaining about the noise again, and the man with the clipboard was just another HOA contractor looking for something to write into a report. I wanted to believe that. 3 days later, she proved me wrong. I was repairing a stretch of fence near my front gate when a black luxury SUV rolled into my driveway without so much as slowing down. Diane stepped out first, dressed in an immaculate cream-colored blazer, despite the 95-degree Texas heat. Behind her came the same man I'd seen at the fence, carrying a leather portfolio instead of the clipboard. Neither of them asked permission to be there. Diane glanced around my property with the same expression someone might use while inspecting a hotel room they intended to criticize. "Mr. Carter," she called, her voice carrying forced politeness, "we need to discuss a serious community issue." I leaned against the fence post, wiping sweat from my hands with an old shop rag. "My property isn't part of your community." "It affects our community," she replied sharply. The suited man opened his portfolio and removed several glossy photographs. He spread them across the hood of her SUV as though presenting evidence in court. Pictures of my tractor, my hay barn, my equipment shed, even close-up shots taken through my fence. I felt my jaw tighten. "When were these taken?" "That isn't important," Diane said. "It is if someone trespassed." She ignored the question. "Our architectural committee has determined your farm equipment significantly lowers surrounding property values. Several homeowners have complained." I couldn't help but laugh. "You build houses next to a working farm. What exactly were they expecting to see? A golf course?" Her smile disappeared. "We're prepared to offer you a solution." The suited man slid a document toward me. It wasn't an offer. It was a demand. According to the paperwork, they wanted me to move my equipment barn, install a $40,000 decorative privacy wall, restrict tractor operations to 2 afternoons a week, and relocate all agricultural equipment so it couldn't be seen from the subdivision. I looked up. "You've got to be kidding." Diane folded her arms. "If you cooperate voluntarily, this can remain civil. And if I don't, we'll pursue every legal remedy available." I handed the papers back without reading another line. "My answer is no." Her eyes narrowed. "You may want to reconsider." "No. This could become very expensive." I smiled politely. "So could filing lawsuits you can't win." Her face reddened. "You think you're above the law because you wear a badge?" "I think I know the law because I enforce it." For a brief second, neither of us spoke. Then Tyler climbed out of the SUV. He couldn't have been more than 19, wearing designer sunglasses and an arrogant grin that looked strangely familiar. He walked slowly around my tractor, running his hand along the massive rear tire. "Pretty nice machine," he said. "It is. Shame if somebody reported it for environmental violations." I stepped between him and the tractor. "Take your hand off my property." He smirked but backed away. "We'll see who's still smiling." As they drove off, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small drone lifted silently from behind their SUV, hovered over my barn for several seconds, then disappeared toward Willow Creek Estates. They weren't just threatening me anymore. They were watching me. And deep down, every instinct I'd developed as a sheriff's deputy told me this wasn't about HOA rules. They were building a case, or worse, creating an opportunity. I just didn't know for what. That drone stayed on my mind for days, not because flying one over rural property was unusual, but because of the way Diane and Tyler had been acting. They weren't simply collecting pictures for another petty HOA complaint. They were documenting everything I owned, especially the tractor. Years in law enforcement had taught me one lesson that never failed. When someone's behavior changes suddenly, there's usually a reason behind it. Instead of reacting emotionally, I started gathering facts. The first person I called wasn't another deputy. It was my oldest friend, Caleb Dawson. Caleb was 53, a licensed land surveyor who had spent nearly 30 years untangling property disputes across Texas. We'd grown up together, hunted deer on these same woods as teenagers, and he had testified as an expert witness in more courtrooms than I could count. When he pulled into my driveway the next morning, he climbed out carrying a weathered metal case filled with survey equipment. "You sound worried," he said. "I am." After hearing everything, Caleb looked toward the subdivision. "Let's verify something before we assume anything." For the next 4 hours, we walked every boundary marker surrounding my property. Most of the original iron pins my grandfather had installed decades earlier were still exactly where county records said they should be, except one. Near the back pasture, Caleb stopped suddenly. He knelt beside what looked like a freshly driven survey stake, painted bright orange. His forehead wrinkled. "This wasn't here 6 months ago." "You sure?" He nodded. Positive. Using his GPS equipment and the original county plat maps stored on his tablet, he measured the boundary 3 separate times. Each reading came back identical. Someone had moved the marker nearly 14 feet onto my land. Caleb stood slowly. "Mason, this isn't a surveying mistake. You think somebody moved it?" "I know somebody moved it." A cold feeling settled in my chest. If that false marker were accepted as legitimate, it would make it appear that part of my equipment barn, and the path I used to move the tractor, sat inside an HOA-controlled easement. Exactly the argument Diane had hinted at. We photographed everything before Caleb carefully uncovered the original iron pin, buried beneath several inches of freshly packed soil. Someone had intentionally hidden it. That afternoon I drove to the Redstone County Clerk's office. Linda Morales, the county records supervisor, had known my family for years. When I explained what we'd found, she disappeared into the archives and returned carrying several oversized plat books, along with digital copies of subdivision filings. "You might want to look at this," she said quietly. She pointed to an amendment submitted just 4 months earlier by Willow Creek Estates HOA. The document requested a boundary clarification affecting the land bordering my farm. I frowned. "I was never notified." "You should have been." Then she handed me another file. "There was also a request for utility access across your property." "I never signed anything." "I know." She hesitated before lowering her voice. "Because your signature doesn't match the one on file." My pulse quickened. I examined the page. At first glance it looked convincing. My name, my address, even a signature that resembled mine. But the more I stared at it, the more obvious the differences became. Someone had forged my signature. Before I could process that discovery, my phone buzzed. It was a motion alert from the security cameras covering my equipment barn. I opened the live feed. A pickup truck was slowly rolling through my front gate. Tyler Whitmore was behind the wheel, and he wasn't alone. The moment I saw Tyler's pickup on my phone, every instinct from 18 years in law enforcement kicked in. I didn't hit the panic button. I didn't call him. I simply switched through each camera angle, forcing myself to stay calm. There were 3 people in the truck. Tyler was driving. A broad-shouldered man wearing a construction company t-shirt sat in the passenger seat, while another young man climbed into the bed before the truck came to a stop beside my equipment barn. None of them looked nervous. They looked prepared. I immediately called dispatch. "This is Deputy Mason Carter. I'm off duty, but I have 3 unauthorized individuals on my property. Possible burglary in progress. Send units, but advise them to respond without lights or sirens." "You recognize the suspects?" "I recognize one." "Copy that." I kept watching. Tyler jumped out first and pulled a ring of keys from his pocket. Keys. My stomach tightened. He walked confidently to the barn door and tried one key after another. Nothing. He cursed loudly enough for one of my cameras to pick up the audio. The construction worker laughed. "Told you his locks would have changed." Tyler reached into his pocket again. This time he pulled out a cordless angle grinder. Sparks exploded as the steel lock gave way. I saved the video to 3 separate cloud backups before forwarding a copy directly to my department's evidence server. There would be no arguing with high-definition footage. Inside the barn, Tyler climbed onto my tractor like he owned it. The diesel engine roared to life. He grinned at his friends. "See?" he shouted. "Mum said once it's moved onto HOA property, we'll claim it was abandoned during the boundary dispute." My heart nearly stopped. This wasn't teenage stupidity. This was a plan. A deliberate theft built around forged documents and a fake property line. As Tyler eased the tractor toward the barn doors, the front loader clipped the frame, ripping loose a heavy steel brace that crashed onto the concrete floor. The three of them panicked. "Go! Go!" one of them yelled. Instead of backing out, Tyler forced the tractor forward, scraping thousands of dollars worth of paint and bodywork against the doorway before finally breaking free. Then he drove straight toward the false survey marker Caleb had uncovered that morning. He actually believed crossing that fake line would somehow make the tractor legally his. Seconds later, the first sheriff's cruiser rolled silently onto my driveway. Then another, and another. Tyler never noticed them until he looked over his shoulder. The grin vanished instantly. He slammed on the brakes so hard the tractor lurched sideways into a stack of feed pallets. Deputies surrounded the machine before anyone could run. I arrived just as Tyler climbed down, desperately insisting it was all a misunderstanding. Then Diane came racing through my front gate in her Mercedes, screaming before she'd even stopped the car. "Nobody touch my son!" She stormed toward the deputies, waving a folder above her head. "I have legal documents proving this equipment belongs inside HOA jurisdiction." One of the deputies accepted the folder. Inside were copies of the same forged boundary amendment and the fake signature I'd just examined at the county clerk's office. Diane smiled with complete confidence. "Now arrest him for filing a false report." The deputy quietly compared the paperwork to the digital records already sent over by the clerk's office. Then he looked up. "Diane, where exactly did you get these documents?" For the first time since this nightmare began, I watched genuine fear replace arrogance in her eyes, because she suddenly realized the forged paperwork wasn't just being questioned anymore. It was evidence, and someone was about to answer for it in court. 6 months later, I walked into the Redstone County Courthouse wearing a Navy suit instead of my sheriff's uniform. For the first time in my career, I wasn't there to provide courtroom security or testify in someone else's case. I was the victim. The gallery was nearly full. Local reporters sat along the back row with notebooks open, and several residents from Willow Creek Estates had shown up after word spread that their HOA president was facing criminal and civil proceedings. I recognized a few neighbors who had once believed every complaint Diane Whitmore had filed against me. Now they avoided looking in my direction. Diane entered with her attorney, Richard Hensley, her posture still rigid but noticeably different. The confidence she'd carried around the neighborhood had been replaced by restless glances and clenched hands. Tyler followed behind her in a dark suit that looked borrowed. He never once looked at me. My attorney, Sarah Bennett, leaned over. "They're already on the defensive," she whispered. "Stay calm. Let the evidence do the talking." Judge Eleanor Brooks entered, and the courtroom rose. "Be seated." After opening statements, Sarah stood before the jury. "This case is not about a neighborhood disagreement," she began. "It is about a calculated scheme involving forged documents, trespassing, burglary, attempted theft, and abuse of authority to seize property that never belonged to the defendants." Richard immediately countered. "My clients acted under a good faith belief that a boundary dispute existed. There was confusion regarding easements and property lines." Sarah didn't argue. Instead, she smiled. "Let's discuss that confusion." Caleb Dawson was the first witness. Using enlarged survey maps, GPS records, and decades of county plats, he carefully explained how the original iron boundary marker had been dug up, concealed beneath fresh soil, and replaced with a new stake 14 feet inside my property. Richard tried to challenge him. "Could weather have displaced the marker?" Caleb answered without hesitation. "No. Weather doesn't repaint survey stakes and drive them into the ground with a post driver." A few jurors smiled. Next came Linda Morales from the county clerk's office. She compared the authentic county filings with the documents Diane had presented to deputies the day of the theft. "These are not the same," Linda testified. Sarah held up both signatures. "Can you explain the differences?" The authentic property records contain Mr. Carter's notarized signature from years earlier. The signature on the amendment was never notarized, contains different handwriting characteristics, and was never legally filed. Richard objected. Speculation. Overruled, Judge Brooks replied. Then Sarah introduced the surveillance footage. The courtroom lights dimmed. Everyone watched Tyler cut the lock off my equipment barn with an angle grinder. The video clearly captured him saying, "Mom said once it's moved onto HOA property, we'll claim it was abandoned." The room fell silent. Sarah paused the video. "Mr. Whitmore," she said after Tyler took the stand, "did you make that statement?" Tyler stared at the monitor. His lips trembled. I don't remember." Sarah pressed a button. The recording played again, clearer this time. Tyler closed his eyes. "Yes." "And who told you that plan would work?" For several long seconds no one moved. Finally, Tyler looked toward his mother. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "My mom did." A gasp swept through the courtroom. Diane shot to her feet. "He's lying." Judge Brooks struck the gavel sharply. "Mrs. Whitmore, sit down immediately." As Diane slowly lowered herself back into her chair, the prosecutor quietly placed one final envelope on the evidence table. I recognized it instantly. It was the forensic handwriting report, and judging by the expression on Diane's attorney's face, he had just realized exactly what it proved. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the air conditioner humming overhead. Judge Eleanor Brooks opened the forensic report and spent several long minutes reading each page. No one spoke. Diane stared straight ahead, gripping the edge of the defense table so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Tyler sat beside her with his head lowered, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Finally, the judge looked up. "The court has reviewed the surveillance footage, certified county property records, expert survey testimony, the forensic handwriting analysis, and the defendant's own statements." She paused. "The evidence establishes a deliberate pattern of deception." Every eye in the courtroom shifted toward Diane. The forged signature submitted in support of the boundary amendment was not created by Mr. Mason Carter. The forensic examiner concluded, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty, that it was written by Diane Whitmore. Diane's attorney slowly closed his legal pad. He didn't object. He couldn't. Judge Brooks continued. "The surveillance footage further demonstrates that Tyler Whitmore knowingly entered Mr. Carter's property without permission, destroyed a lock, operated equipment he did not own, and attempted to remove that equipment under the false belief that fraudulent documents would protect him." Tyler quietly wiped tears from his face. "I therefore find in favor of the plaintiff on all civil claims." She turned toward the criminal side of the case. "As to the criminal charges, probable cause has been overwhelmingly established. The court orders the immediate transfer of the complete case file to the district attorney for prosecution." Diane's shoulders slumped. The fight was over. The judge wasn't finished. The Homeowners Association's actions, under the direction of its president, exposed its members to substantial legal liability. The court further awards Mr. Carter damages for property repairs, replacement of the barn door and lock, legal expenses, lost use of equipment, emotional distress directly related to the fraudulent campaign, and punitive damages. The final amount appeared on the courtroom monitor, $487,350. A murmur spread through the gallery. Several Willow Creek Estates homeowners looked stunned. One elderly resident actually stood and said, "She told us none of this was true." Outside the courthouse, television cameras were waiting. The district attorney announced that additional charges, including forgery, tampering with public records, attempted theft, criminal trespass and conspiracy, would move forward based on the evidence presented during the hearing. Within 2 weeks, Willow Creek Estates held an emergency meeting. Diane was removed as HOA president by an overwhelming vote. The board hired independent auditors, rescinded every action she'd taken during the previous 2 years, and issued written apologies to several homeowners, including me, who had been targeted through selective enforcement. A month later, workers removed the fake survey marker forever. Caleb and I watched as the original iron pin was reset in concrete, exactly where my grandfather had placed it decades earlier. Standing there, I rested one hand on my repaired tractor. The scratches had been fixed. The barn doors were new. The land looked exactly as it always had. For the first time in nearly a year, The weight I'd been carrying finally lifted. Justice hadn't erased what happened, but it had restored something even more valuable than my tractor. It restored the truth. A year has passed since the courtroom doors closed behind us, and life has finally settled back into the rhythm I always loved. Most mornings, I'm out on my tractor before sunrise, watching the first light spill across the pasture my grandfather once walked. The pecan trees still sway in the Texas breeze, the pond still reflects the evening sky, and the old farmhouse remains exactly where it belongs. Every time I drive through those fields, I'm reminded that some things are worth defending, no matter how difficult the fight becomes. The experience changed me in ways I never expected. As a sheriff's deputy, I had spent years helping other people seek justice. I never imagined I'd have to fight so hard for my own. What kept me going wasn't anger. It was the determination to protect my family's legacy and refuse to let intimidation replace the truth. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this. Never let someone convince you to surrender what is rightfully yours simply because they seem powerful. Keep records. Know your rights. Stay calm under pressure. And when the truth is on your side, don't be afraid to stand your ground. Thank you for spending your time with me and following this journey from beginning to end. I truly appreciate every one of you who listened. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an overreaching HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who tried to take advantage of you? How did you handle it? Share your experience in the comments. I read as many as I can. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another true-to-life property rights and HOA justice story. Until next time, take care of the people you love, stand up for what's right, and remember, the truth may take time, but it has a way of finding the light. End.